think we're going to get started now, folks. My name is Jan Fraser, and I'm going to be chairing this workshop, or this part of the workshop today. I'm a member of Solidarity Against Austerity, and also representing the elementary teachers of Ontario. Today, this workshop is to discuss, it's part of our May Day, part of the activities surrounding May Day, and I guess you all know that we're planning a march for May 1st, and we hope everyone will be there too. This workshop today is to discuss austerity as we know it and see it here in Canada and abroad, and its effects. We will be having 3 speakers today. There will be questions at the end of the presentations, and coffee break, and then we'll be breaking up into smaller groups to discuss what we might be able to do to fight back against this austerity agenda. On our panel today, we have Jen Moore, who is the Latin America Coordinator for Mining Watch. We have Ben Powless, who is with Defenders of the Land, which is part of a national indigenous network. And we have Donald Swartz, former professor at Carleton and member of the Socialist Project. And we're going to begin today with Donald.
Thanks, Janet. I'm supposed to give a kind of a synthetic overview. I had some input yesterday from unnamed people, and if there's any problems, it's their fault. All right, so I want to try to give some background to the austerity agenda, put it in a bit of historical context, and then bring out some dimensions to it. I think that, to talk about an austerity agenda, this is a fairly recent conversation, but what people are talking about is actually not new. And it's certainly not just simply about eliminating waste in government spending or balancing budgets. I think we should understand austerity as the most recent and accelerated phase of a 30-year project to increase the wealth and power of capital or business at the expense of working people. And I mean working people in the broadest sense, not just union members, but anybody that works for a wage or a salary, would like to work for a wage or salary but can't find a job, or who's in school and is going to be looking for a job. I think that the roots go all the way back to the crisis of the 70s. Those of us that are old enough can remember what happened then. Growth stopped, profits disappeared, unemployment was fairly substantial, there was inflation, and all that signaled the end of that golden age of capitalism, the post-war growth model. In the 80s, we saw what I think is quite properly called a bourgeois counter-revolution, which ultimately brought us to the neoliberal global order that we've come to love so much. Began in the US with the head of the Treasury, Volcker, introducing an incredibly deflationary budget that drove unemployment in the States up to over 15%, and was pretty much accompanied by Reagan's decision to fire the striking air traffic controllers. And those two events together let everybody know that the world was quite different. So this counter-revolution, I think we can talk about it as having 2 basic elements. One of which was to aim at all the post-war reforms, union rights, pensions, social security, etc. Because all of those things had strengthened workers vis-a-vis their employers. They limited management's arbitrary power, and in a certain sense reduced workers' dependence on wages for survival. Right? If you lost your job, you didn't lose your health care. It's a big difference. In Canada, we didn't have that mass firing, but we had, nonetheless, an incredible attack on union rights. Various kinds of wage freezes and changes in legislation, but probably the outstanding element was back to work legislation, where workers who went out on strike, all of a sudden the government would pass a law saying you don't have that right any longer, go back to work, and if you don't, we're going to fine you thousands and thousands of dollars and possibly jail you. During the 1980s, various levels of government passed back to work legislation 49 times. The second part of that was rollbacks in social protection. The point being to tie living standards to wage income as much as possible and force people into the labor market. The major reform was in the area of unemployment insurance. Around 1980, about 80% of people who were unemployed got unemployment insurance. By the end of the 80s, and today, it was under 50%. And it's not just that fewer people are eligible for it, you get less, you get it for a shorter period of time, and one of the key changes, and this kind of gives you the flavor, in the old days, you could get unemployment insurance if you'd worked long enough, whether you got fired or laid off, or whether you quit because your employer was harassing you. By the end of the 80s, the only way you could get unemployment insurance was if your boss didn't want you any longer. You didn't like your boss, tough shit. Welfare rates were cut as well, and eliminating various kinds of medical services from coverage under healthcare does the same thing. All those things make the importance of having a job ever greater. The other half of the agenda was to create a whole new set of opportunities for corporations to make money, what we could call expanding the scope and scale of markets. Free trade was the key to this. Which wasn't so much about trade, but about expanding the investment rights for corporations and allowing a company to organize its work, its production processes across border without having to tie production and sales. For example, in Canada, you can think of the Auto Pact that started in the mid-60s, where the auto companies had to produce cars in Canada in proportion to sales of cars. Free trade eliminated those kinds of restrictions. Companies could move as much production to Mexico as they wanted and still sell into the Canadian market. Well, on the one hand, they're moving to a significant extent production to areas where wages are lower, and then at the same time putting pressure on Canadian workers to lower their wages in order to become competitive. Another way of expanding markets was through privatization and public sector, private sector partnerships, P3s. They do the same thing, they create new market opportunities for companies. It's not because they're cheaper, it's not because they deliver better services, the literature is all quite clear on this. It's an opportunity to make money, and it's often an opportunity to pay lower wages. If you can get out of a union contract, or at least to fragment workers who formerly all worked for the same employer, they now had to bargain with many different employers. And the third element was the loosening of environmental and labor market regulation. Again, the same thing. The point is to make forms of production profitable that wouldn't be under stringent or more stringent environmental or labor standards. The emergence of this global capitalist order that states created also put pressure on all of them to make themselves attractive places for companies to invest. Cuts in corporate taxes were central to this. Today in Ontario, tax rates are actually quite a bit lower than they are throughout the whole Midwest. And this, of course, squeezed government revenues and put constant pressure on the quality of public services and the levels of public services. I could say a little bit about the ways in which political freedoms were constrained as part of this. Obviously, attacking trade union rights undermines freedom of association, but there's a number of people in this room that are familiar with the way in which the RCMP and others undermined protests against globalization or foreign invasions, etc. All right, let me now turn to the immediate past to austerity, but let me start by saying that this counter-revolution has been incredibly successful. As Warren Buffett put it, there's a class war going on and my class is winning. There's been a stunning growth in profits as a share of national income, declines in the level of unionization, the acceptance of neoliberalism as the basis of politics by social democratic parties, and pretty much the disappearance of all the old working class based communist parties. This neoliberal order has also been incredibly unstable, with many crises, the most recent one being the financial crisis of 2008-9, which made austerity a household word. Well, we know the basic story of this, right? It began with the collapse in the American housing bubble that had been financed by subprime mortgages. These mortgages had been packaged by the banks that lent them and sold all around the world. When the housing bubble collapsed, the mortgages became worthless, and there was a financial crisis that hit every country in the West. How did the state respond? First of all, with a massive bailout of the financial sector, one way or another, the government socialized all the bad debts, and they became public debt. And then in 2009, all the capitalist countries in the West engaged in a coordinated economic stimulus to ward off economic collapse. Much of this involved, again, additional tax cuts and/or environmentally destructive infrastructure projects. So all of a sudden we have a world of deficits. We have public ownership of car companies, of some banks. Some people think it's the end of neoliberalism, but this wasn't the case. The failure of the unions and the left generally to challenge these kinds of bailouts allowed the government's measures to achieve a certain level of stability and left neoliberalism intact. It left the bank's control of a globalized financial system intact. So then the outstanding question became, who's going to pay for the costs involved? Right? And this is where austerity comes in. And we can talk about two broad dimensions, and they're actually familiar ones. I mean, one is to redirect money now spent on salaries for public employees and on social programs for all workers towards paying down the debt. In Ottawa, we've seen lots of layoffs and cutbacks in the public sector, but that's the tip of the iceberg. Think of the increase in the age at which you can collect old age security. That's $20,000 taken out of an average worker's lifetime income. And then, of course, the renewed attack on public sector unions. A spate of back-to-work legislation against CUPW, against Air Canada workers, railway workers, teachers in Ontario, as well as BC. And this was incredibly harsh legislation, and it reflected, among other things, the government's intention to lower public sector wages, to put them in line with the concessions that workers in the private sector had made, to introduce two-tiered wages and two-tiered pension systems that were imposed on steel workers in Hamilton and nickel miners in Sudbury, for example. And of course, we've also most recently seen the emergence of the challenge to the RAND formula and the Basic Union Security Clause in an attempt to mainly to make it more difficult for unions to spend on political activities. The other part of the strategy is to gain new tax revenues to pay off the debt through an intensified pursuit of export-led growth. We see this in the attempts to organize new free trade agreements with Europe, but above all, in the attempts to support the building of pipelines to carry oil from tar sands into the States or to the West Coast for other places. And part and parcel of this strategy is to reduce the labor and regulatory costs of exports to enhance the profitability of these projects. So the temporary foreign worker program to supply firms with cheaper labor, no shortage of Canadian workers, just can't find them at the price that the companies find profitable. The new work requirements in order to be eligible for EI, and of course sharp reductions in environmental protections and indigenous rights, as well as the various attacks on our rights to express dissent that Ben and Jen are going to talk about. That, and to kind of point us towards the second part of this, there's no mistaking the weakness of the resistance to austerity. And without a better understanding of why this has been the case, a serious discussion of this kind of thing, it's going to be very difficult to develop more effective strategies. Thanks.
Thanks, Don. Can I have your watch? Please, can I use that? It's easier than looking on there. Thanks. Thanks, Donald. Our next speaker is Jen Moore from Mining Watch. And Jen.
Yeah, so I am going to touch on sort of how our freedom to protest and right to dissent is being impacted, but I'm going to do that from the context of the extractive industry and my experiences really with the Canadian extractive industry and its promotion in Latin America, and then kind of work backward to some of the trends that we're seeing here in Canada, and I think some of the serious costs and ultimately crimes that are taking place in that context. So the current, seeing that the current austerity agenda really does incorporate, as part of what's going on, especially in the last couple of years here in Canada, a further harmonization of Canadian public and foreign policy at the service of corporations that are particularly dedicated to the violent imposition of predatory extractivism. And I'm going to try to explain what that is. And I think that concept of extractivism being quite useful and something that is being reflected on very much right now in Latin America. I think this is both part of the neoliberal framework that's been rolled out and that Donald explained over the past 30 years, which in the terms of the mining industry, especially in the global south, has meant privatization of mining sectors to enable the influx of foreign capital, loosening of administrative controls and environmental and public protections for people affected by it, although I would say the protections, particularly for indigenous rights and rural peoples, were never quite that great to begin with. And then also other incentives, particularly the weakening of tax and royalty regimes, to create very favorable circumstances for investments, particularly in terms of Canadian foreign investment in the mining sector. The Canadian mining sector is much more globalized than the Canadian oil sector, for instance. But this is also a neo-colonial framework, and I think that we need to see the two things together in order to think about our strategies for resistance. In Canada and what Canada is promoting in terms of unsustainable extraction is very much at the expense of Indigenous rights, and very much a program of continuous dispossession and negation of the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada and in the Americas. So I want to start a little bit just thinking, and I think that this sort of adds up in terms of who benefits, and it's important to see the links in terms of thinking about extractivism around oil, and particularly here at home, mining, also agro-industry, and the very close links between speculative financial systems. So I want to just introduce the concept as I understand it of extractivism, based on some current thinking in Latin America, which has been going on to try to conceptualize the central problem that's being seen with the economic development model, which is this high or increasing dependence on natural resource extraction, and particularly primary resource extraction for export. Part of the rationale in denominating an ism is to connote how it's extraction in excess. Just to give a really concrete example of this, in Mexico, they currently estimate that there's been twice as much gold and 1.5 as much silver extracted in the last decade as was extracted in 300 years, between 1521 and 1830. So a real ramping up in terms of, obviously industrialization, but sort of absolutely kind of hyper nature to it. So it's certainly in the context of the global south, more so than in countries like Canada, extraction is taking place with very little or no value-added processing. It brings along with it concentration of land, competition for other livelihood activities, such as competition between mining and agricultural activities in terms of demand for water, but also surface land. And in its most aggressive form is being conceptualized as predatory extractivism. And recently, the term was coined hyper-extractivism in order to understand and incorporate the idea of use of violence to impose projects on indigenous and rural peoples in order to extract large volumes of primary resources. And very much thinking about extractivism incorporating oil, mining, agro-industry, African palm, and perhaps there could be some extension. It'd be interesting to think about this, about whether or not the way in which some of the climate change programs and carbon credit programs are being implemented couldn't also be sort of captured in this idea. That we're seeing is this kind of fortified state-industry pact to impose mining on communities, with coinciding processes of stigmatization, criminalization, violence, and displacement. And I think we start to see resonance of that here at home too. And this analysis also distinguishes between those who are making some reforms in the region, some of the reforms to step away from strictly neoliberal models, such as to capture greater rents for distribution into social programs and other more progressive initiatives, as neo-extractivist. So this kind of gradient of extractivism, and whether or not countries fall into the category of promoting predatory extractivism or neo-extractivism, there's really a growing consensus that this sort of dependence on natural resource extraction and primary resource extraction leads to policies and practices that are tending to deny the rights of indigenous, Campesino, and Afro-descendant peoples, to jeopardize ecologically, socially, and culturally important areas, to deplete natural resources, and to threaten crucial water supplies. And in terms of the costs to democratic participation and dissent, I want to draw on a recent article from Raul Sibeki. I was just having a conversation just before we got started about one of his recent books. Raul is an Uruguayan writer and a social movement analyst. And he writes that extractivism is much more than a productive model or the accumulation of capital. Rather, it's part of the speculative financial system that currently dominates the world. In our countries, it has predatory impacts. It's creating a new block of power, politically corrupt, polarizing, socially exclusive, and with detrimental environmental impacts. He notes that its advance relies on important political backing, not just from parties, but also from universities, local and national governments, media, and intellectuals, and adds how the impacts of mining are not just environmental, but that very much contribute to social disintegration through the dispossession of indigenous and rural peoples from their lands. And he was putting this very much in the context of some of the recent coups that have taken place in Latin America, seeing that it remains important to challenge U.S. imperialism and attempts to destabilize and undermine governments in the region, but that the last decade of extractivism in Latin America is ultimately also strengthening the right. And he's not just identifying politicians or conservative politicians or parties in this context, but also what he calls a very diffuse right, one that is a social and cultural right that promotes individualism, atrocious consumerism, disdain for the poor, and particularly people of color. So seeing the necessity in processes of resistance to challenge imperialism, but also the extractivist model. And I think that critique is very much coming out of seeing the polarizing impacts of the extractive industry, even in left-leaning countries, where you're seeing really, polarization, not just down right-left lines, but also exclusion of indigenous and campesino movements that are fighting for land rights and are fighting for protection of socially and ecologically sensitive areas, and as being excluded from these projects, and actually very overt processes of stigmatization, racism, and criminalization of those movements, by some of the governments that internationally are regarded as some of the more left-leaning. And my most direct experience of this was in Ecuador, where the current administration regularly and with deep elements of racism frequently speaks out against the campesino indigenous movements as being the greatest threat to the political project in that country, and has criminalized some 200 indigenous and campesino leaders as being eco-terrorists, infantile ecologists, whereas these are the people that have been pushing for plurinationality, more inclusion, more broadening and recognition of the nationalities present in that country, that have been involved in liberatory struggles for really hundreds of years, and that translate into defense of land and water and forests and other ways of life and other visions of development. And I think we see elements of that in many other countries of the region, and very much through Canadian export, the model that we've been supporting and developing, we've been reinforcing those trends. So not sort of quite in the classic U.S. imperialism style of looking for the destabilization elements, but rather supporting an economic model that really is driving a wedge in progressive processes in the region. So coming back to how to situate Canada in this model, I see Canada both as a country that's deepening predatory extractivism here at home, and also exporting it abroad with all the corresponding impacts and costs to communities, the environment, and movements for liberation and autonomy. And I think in Canada, we can look really specifically at legislation that was passed under the omnibus bills, C-38 and C-35, which were passed without consultation of Indigenous peoples and with limited debate in Parliament or amongst the Canadian public, that have changed over 100 different pieces of legislation in the past year, and regulations that are going to have significant impacts on the environment and Aboriginal and treaty rights, as well as public rights. Approximately 99% of the lakes and rivers in our country have lost protection for navigation and environmental assessment, that could now be more vulnerable to industrial impacts and development. And many of these on or affecting Indigenous peoples. And as well, last year, the federal government announced this new approach to natural resource project review in terms of one project, one review, with much stricter timelines and stricter guidelines around participation, be that for directly affected peoples or for people that might otherwise want to intervene and see the impacts of a project as in the public interest. So we're seeing a fast tracking and streamlining of environmental assessment processes, and also I think really overt attempts on the part of the federal government to discredit and silence the voices of those who are speaking out, or threatening to hijack this regulatory system to achieve their so-called radical ideological agenda. I think we've seen in a much more explicit way an identification between concepts of the national interest and the very narrow economic interests of the oil industry, mining and gas industry. I think some just concrete examples, the muzzling of scientists, shutting down or cutbacks to important scientific research centers, restructuring the Canadian International Development Agency, such that organizations that have been critical of Canadian foreign policy are being defunded, that you're also seeing the favoring of funding for NGOs that are willing to either remain silent or give very explicit support to the government and industry agenda. We've also seen examples of sharing of intelligence between the Canadian government and the oil industry on the activities of Indigenous organizations and groups. And we've also seen the reinforcement of what I see as a very duplicitous corporate social responsibility agenda for the mining sector, which is very much a promotion strategy, and it's rolling out through, right now, I think something that's very disturbing, the capture of new academic spaces. The Canadian government has just channeled $25 million into the creation of the Canadian International Institute for Extractive Industries, which is going to be set up at the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser University, which is going to be, I think, a new source of voices and backing to the NGOs and mining sector, all within the banner to sort of justify and further promote this very misdirected and two-sided corporate social responsibility strategy, which is not even a policy, it really is a PR strategy for the industry, and a very dangerous one. So I think I'm going to leave some thoughts in terms of like how we respond to this, to the discussion, and let Ben go from there.
That's perfect. You're exactly right. Thank you, Jen. And I have to apologize to Ben because I pronounced his name incorrectly, which I'm going to blame on Donald for his poor printing. So Ben is actually Ben Powless, and he's with Defenders of the Land, and I'll leave it to you, Ben.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to, concur exactly with what Jen is saying about, Latin America, and which she's concluding on, being very much applicable to First Nations in Canada, and also underscore how this, what's not being called austerity as a sort of social phenomenon, as an economic political phenomenon, is nothing exactly new to First Nations, but is just sort of being, I think, expanded and applied to other communities across the country now. And I think we also need to sort of recognize that in a few different forms. First Nations have been dealing with, for the past decades, a 2% cap on any increases in funding for social services for First Nations on reserve. And that's a very strict cap that has nothing to do with population increases or any inflationary pressures at all, which has meant that, per capita, funding has gone down for First Nations across the board, across every community in the past number of decades, to the point where Cindy Blackstock with the First Nations Child and Family Services estimates that the average education spending per child is about 20% less for First Nations than for non-Native children across the country. They're actually pursuing a lawsuit against the government right now for that discrepancy, very much based on that. And so, in a similar sort of throwback to the early 70s, even late 60s for First Nations, we have, again, another government that's pursuing this line of attack against First Nations, all under the guise of, raising the standards of First Nations, bringing First Nations into the 21st century, bringing them into the modern era, civilizing us again. And I think one of the big reasons that they're aligned to this, of course, ideologically, especially this current government has no real regard for anybody having extra rights, anybody having any sort of extra protections. Very much committed to a kind of free-for-all version of capitalism. Another reason that they're considered that they really want to sort of abdicate their responsibility is to again save money, cut back on some of those funding, slash a lot of those programs, which they've been doing over the past number of years to a considerable degree in First Nations communities. They've already cut funding for families of the Sisters in Spirit initiative, which is pursuing justice for missing and murdered women. They've cut back funding for health services, for of course education services, for a number of other services in First Nations communities. But I think one of the other big reasons that very much fits into what Jen was talking about has been to really try and also subsidize corporations in Canada, as Canada pursues a model of sort of regressing to a primary economy, one based on commodities, natural resources as they call them. And of course, there's no other bigger project in Canada than the Alberta tar sands, which is situated in the back of over a dozen First Nations Métis communities who receive very little, even mainstream sort of coverage, understanding of what those communities are facing, which has to do with along the lines of such toxic air, water, and even pollution of animals, fish, and other wildlife, that people are starting to get cancer as early as in their 20s now. In some of the communities, the water levels, they're being told that they can no longer drink from lakes and rivers that communities have always completely depended upon. And some of these places are remote flying communities where they're now having to buy bottled water, for example, at the cost of sometimes as much as $40 to $60 for a case of bottled water to be flown into these places and distributed. This isn't, of course, exclusive to Alberta, but I think is very much felt and seen most directly there. Also because the tar sands operations have only been in operation for about 10 years. They've really only ramped up since the beginning of the 2000s with the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, pushing up the price of oil to make it finally profitable. But some of these things have been going on for years, for decades, even much closer to home in Ontario. We have the communities of Kitchimanakasip and Innuwak First Nation up in Northern Ontario, where their chief and council actually faced jail time because they opposed platinum mining just on the outskirts of the lake in which the community is situated on. They argue that it would potentially poison their lake forever. They tried to stop the mining and they were arrested for it and all sent to jail. Closer to Ottawa, we had the community of Sharrae Lake in Chibougamauan, Algonquin First Nation, in which Bob Loveless was also sent to jail. Other community members faced fines of tens of thousands of dollars for trying to stop a uranium mine with just over an hour away from Ottawa. Community of Grassy Narrows, Northern Ontario, had to be relocated in the 70s due to mercury poisoning from industrial logging operations, and still continues to face a lot of pressure from the logging industry. These are kind of ongoing, consistent things that are only being increased in recent years. And of course, the other big one out in British Columbia now is not just the Enbridge pipeline representing actually 2 pipelines, but a series of about 6 to 7 proposed pipelines that are going to crisscross over a lot of First Nations communities' territories. We've only started recently really hearing about all of the disastrous effects of these pipelines, where in the U.S. they're saying that there's a pipeline actual spill, leak, any sort of release on average of I think 1.6 times per day. Now that they're actually starting to publish the actual data. So what the government's had to do, of course, is change some of those environmental laws, start to retract some of the environmental review processes. In particular, in British Columbia, this has meant saying to First Nations that their Aboriginal rights to consultation and accommodation don't actually apply anymore. They can only apply to participate as any other, interested party in the Enbridge Northern Gateway process. And so the government's basically said, we no longer respect your constitution and guaranteed rights. You can just sort of participate in this the same way as, anybody who happens to live in the area might, participate in this process. And, we'll hear your opinion. You can come speak at our things. We'll write it down, and then we'll give you our verdict later, which the government has, for all express purposes, said they intend to pursue at any cost to the public. And these changes in the environmental laws, that were most of them which were contained in the omnibus budget bills, really was actually the foundation of the I Don't Know More movement, which I think a lot of the mainstream media sort of neglected. It was actually born out of widespread opposition to the environmental changes in the omnibus budget bills, as well as a few provisions that started to seek the privatization of reserve lands, which has also been a big sort of ideological push and an economic push for this government as well. They've started to lay the ground towards changing the status of reserve lands. And for people who are unaware, reserve lands are basically held in trust by the government to this day. They basically fall outside of any other legal arrangement of land in Canada, in which they are, in a sense, communally owned, communally occupied by the reserve itself. Reserve lands can change hands within the reserve, but cannot be sold, cannot be divided, cannot be sold to anybody who's not a member of the community, not a member of the reserve. And so that's been a way that, up to this point, reserves have remained more or less intact. In the U.S. for a number of decades, starting I think in the 40s or 50s, they started to engage in a similar process of basically turning the reserves into parcels and starting to sell them off. And all intentions from what the government's saying is that they're committed to pursuing a similar line here in Canada, which would in many ways essentially be the end of First Nations communities as communities. It really pretends that a lot of these reserves would be basically sold off potentially piece by piece, or in the case of some communities where the Chief and Council negotiates that, they could be sold off as entire patches of land to oil companies, mining companies, forestry companies, even for agriculture, depending on where their community lies. And there's even a sort of real big precedent for this within NAFTA, where NAFTA basically required that the communal land holdings in Mexico basically be parcelized and privatized to be able to be sold to American companies and corporations who wanted to operate there. So that's already happened under some of these free trade laws, and I think it's something that Canada definitely wants to see happen to First Nations communities here. So I Don't Know More as a movement was really spurred as a active resistance against some of these initiatives to privatize reserve lands and also abrogate a lot of the environmental protections that were there, and actually garnered a lot of support initially, and to this day from a lot of non-native Canadians, which I think surprised the government, surprised a lot of people in a lot of those industries, and I think it actually scared them as well. Because as soon as the I Don't Know More movement sort of stepped out and stepped up some of its actions, what we began to see was really an all-out attack on the image, the perception of First Nations, to really try and portray them as enemies. And some of this started last year. Some of this started with the First Nations opposition to Enbridge pipeline, as well as the tar sands. And so starting last year, you had the government going out and calling First Nations, as well as environmental groups, extremists, saying that we were getting billions and billions of dollars from Hollywood celebrities, which was news to all of us. I expected a movement. I'm still waiting for my paycheck. And so they really began this kind of movement within the media to sort of demonize and try and divide First Nations. Those attacks really started ramping up in the past number of months. Particularly they chose to use Chief Theresa Spence and orchestrated a number of personal and sexist attacks against her character, her body appearance, her weight issues, attacks on her personal life, on her personal spending, as a sort of way to say, wait a minute, no, the the federal government doesn't have any obligations. Look at Theresa Spence, she has a car, she has a house, she's doing great. There's no problem with crowding or education in these communities. And so suddenly those attacks became about accountability, the accountability of First Nations, and that was one that the government has been particularly quick to pounce on, and so they actually managed just I think within the last 2 months, First Nations Accountability Act, something along those lines, which basically says they're going to publish all of the First Nations chiefs and leaders' salaries on a website somewhere, so that it's available in the public, and the government trotting this out is saying, oh, this is just about us trying to make sure First Nations are accountable to Canadians, to the citizens. And that was particularly infuriating. Number one, because a lot of us recognize it right away as a real racist kind of tool to sort of create resentment and sort of say, oh look, here's 10 chiefs who are making a lot of money. Well, what are they doing? Why should they be making that much money? Why? It was definitely recognized as a tool to sort of create animosity towards First Nations, division amongst a lot of Canadians, and really shift the issue and agenda away. And almost immediately, there was reaction against it from First Nations for I think very good principled reasons, arguing that First Nations as as a nation-to-nation government and relationship are not responsible to Stephen Harper, do not report to Stephen Harper, are not report directly to their own citizens, and this bill was basically an infringement on, First Nations' own, governments and their own societies. And the government quickly seized on that and said, oh, look at that, First Nations don't want to be accountable. They're just playing the same old game. Which, so a lot of these attacks actually worked in the media, because there wasn't any time, there wasn't any availability to go into, well, what is the nature of a treaty relationship? What is the nature of, First Nations sovereignty and self-government? No, it was quickly reduced to a debate about, oh, look, First Nations don't want you to know what they're making, how much money they're making. Obviously, they're just trying to hide from public scrutiny. And polls started showing that, Canadian citizens that by and large were, we're starting to blame First Nations issues on First Nations, on their leadership, on, corruptibility and a host of those other things on reserve. Yeah, and so, the media largely swallowed these excuses. They started publishing them unquestioningly. And I think as recently as about a month ago, the government started sneaking in a really, I think, dangerous little clause into some of the funding agreements that they have with First Nations for their social services, saying that to get their funding, First Nations had to agree to support the government and not to protest their legislation, which I think is really sort of a scary sort of provision of basically trying to legally outlaw dissent and basically hold First Nations, almost at gunpoint, saying you're not going to get this money unless you promise to support us and promise not to participate in any of these protests. And partially it was also not to talk about the details of those provisions. And then, of course, there have been attacks on, any particular First Nations and groups and communities that actually do speak out, that do orchestrate anything against the government. And the government's been leading that over the past few years by actually taking efforts to monitor and spy on First Nations. And so we're running out of time, but I think the one point that I want to sort of close on is to respond to this. I think there's a continued need to really try and inform ourselves about a lot of these issues, and I know that's definitely made hard. Even I'm not 100% up to date on all of these issues. It's very hard to often find actual good credible reporting, information on a lot of these things and what's happening behind the scenes. And so another crucial aspect is to actually hold the media to account on what they're publishing, the views that they're purveying, because that has a tremendous influence on what middle of the road mainstream Canadians see and have reflected their views of First Nations. And then of course it's to actually stand in solidarity with indigenous struggles as they're going on. And so as defenders of the land, in coordination with Idle No More, we're planning on a number of different actions, different opportunities going up through the rest of this year. Particularly this summer, we're aiming to hold events in solidarity with the Healing Walk in Alberta, which is, I think, in its 4th year this year, of First Nations in opposition to the expansion of the tar sands, and it's going to be expanding through British Columbia as well, and we're hoping to get support for that out here in Ontario, where Enbridge is also pushing its own pipeline across Ontario, Quebec, to pipe tar sands oil to refiners on the east. And so I think that these are all going to be crucial efforts to really, demonstrate solidarity with First Nations to help resist this attack on First Nations rights, on First Nations communities, and at the end of the day, as I mentioned, really all of our communities, because I think First Nations communities are just attacked on first in many cases because they're held as the most weak, the most sort of foreign, remote to Canadian experience, and they're the ones that the government can get away with attacking most easily, and I think that we have to do everything that we can to try and stop that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. So we have a lot to think about from our 3 speakers here, and we're going to open it up now to folks to make comments or to ask questions of our panelists, and I'm opening up to you now. Do we have anyone who'd like to begin?
This is a question for you. You talked about how resilient this plutocracy is and the power that they still maintain, how fluid capitalism, it still moves. Some people point to Europe as as a potential, the implosion there, the coming implosion or predicted implosion. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think this will continue, what you call the counter-revolution? What is the possibility here for some kind of implosion, either in a financial sense or political sense?
Well, I'm not a tea leaf reader. This counter-revolution, if you want to call it that, has encountered various levels of resistance, right? I mean, it's been much more difficult to roll back post-war gains in France, for example, than it has been other places. But the screws continue to tighten on those countries because of the external pressures that are set up through this global order. So the unemployment rates are quite high. I mean, and there was they and the Germans to some extent have been able to avoid some of the precariousness that and in terms of jobs that we've experienced here, but at the expense of levels of employment.
Do we have other people who'd like to comment? Okay, Diane?
This year, thanks to my union, I was able to travel to Nicaragua on the issues of women and children, indigenous, and the communities and what's happening within. I was able to visit sweatshops, and we talked a lot about the mining and the Canadian companies and what was happening out there to these people. And one thing I'd like to point out is communities like Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, a lot of these people who are fighting for their lands out there are being killed by these companies. Mm-hmm. Anybody who speaks out are being killed by these companies. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that some of it will eventually reach here, if it hasn't already, that we just haven't heard about. So I'm very aware of the things that you speak of, and it would be nice to be able to get it out to the broader community, because these are Canadian mining companies that are going out there doing this to other countries and other people, and they're not being held accountable here. And people here do not realize that it's our Canadian mining companies that are going out there doing this onto others.
Could I just comment on that? I think what you say is really, really important, and I also would just add that there are companies, but it's also the involvement of our government, very activist involvement of our government to enable their operations to move forward, and very much as again a pushback against the very successful social movements that have existed. Using the example of Honduras, the Canadian Embassy, Department of Foreign Affairs, and Canadian International Development Agency just succeeded in getting a new mining law passed in Honduras that lifts a 7-year mining moratorium on new projects and new mining concessions. In the post-coup context, which Canada also provided very tacit support for, and very much in the interests of our and other foreign investments in the mining sector, at a time when the threats in terms of both to the lives and also just to the well-being of individuals and whole communities has never been greater in Honduras. So I think I'm starting to think about how our companies are a problem. We don't hold them accountable, but our companies are also a symptom of a very unjust neocolonial system that we're actively promoting with our own dollars and officials going down and being very much involved in meddling in the policies and things that are being rolled out in these countries. So I think for me that's also an important element of what's going on, that now I start to see, the arrogance of a Goldcorp or any of these companies as really being something that we're very much enabling.
If I can just respond to that a little bit too. I think, I've spent time in Nicaragua as well, actually, in Peru and a few other places, also looking at some of the issues around oil mining development and the resistance there. And as you described, the situation is severely drastic in a lot of places in Latin America, other parts of the global South. But I think we should also not have this idea that these kind of things are only things that take place across the other parts of the world. Because there have been a number of incidents, where in Canada, it's abroad, sometimes it's private security forces that respond to that, sometimes it's paramilitary forces under the control of the government, questionably, sometimes it's direct state elements that are operating here. In Canada, it's often been, the actual government itself that responds to these, periods of unrest, with direct state force, and so that's primarily been targeted at First Nations communities here in Canada, but often in a number of incidents that most people don't even hear about. And so most people were familiar with aspects of the Oka crisis, for example, which was a dispute over putting in a golf course over a native burial ground, okay, or the Ipperwash crisis, which Dudley George was shot and killed trying to reclaim part of a park from the Canadian military, which was using it as a dumping ground, basically. Gustafson Lake out in British Columbia, where there was one of the biggest sieges on anybody ever in Canadian history, and that's sort of direct applications of state violence here in Canada against Native communities, and where those are haven't happened, the government has enforced other ways of dealing with it. And so, as I mentioned, a few other communities. But there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of incidents where, First Nations, in attempting to pursue their rights, aren't dealt with on a political level, but end up dealing with the criminal justice system. And, people often receive fines, receive jail sentences, and many of these never, make it anywhere beyond, maybe a local newspaper, if anything. And so these kind of things also are going on, constantly, consistently, all over the place, as we see a constant rollback of First Nations rights, First Nations jurisdiction, but even just respect for, each other and respect for, our different societies.
Yeah, thanks to the whole panel. Very challenging subjects, but what I really appreciate about these three different presentations is that you start to see the threads and the connections between the those targeted and those affected, and that whether we call it austerity or sort of accelerated liberalism or whatever, that really this cuts across the entire society. What I find interesting, and I'm involved in this grouping Solidarity Against Austerity, is this challenge we've got in trying to generalize an understanding and recognition of how widely this cuts across. Because when you think about the resistance that you've all talked about in different ways, so often our resistance, our social movement organizing, is put in a silo. It's one identity. It's First Nations alone, or workers alone, or environmentalists as a community, in separate categories. And I think what a movement against austerity is partly about drawing these links and building larger, broader, more diverse movements. And so my question is really to Ben, in a way, because I appreciate your talk, and I just want to ask about the organizations that you're working with, in particular Defenders of the Land, which is an organization that I'm just coming to learn about more recently, as an organization, an indigenous organization across the country, working on indigenous rights and identifying these same problems that you're talking about. What I find really interesting and inspiring about it is it seems to me that it's very oriented to building alliance relationships with non-indigenous people, which I think those of us who are non-indigenous, who want to fight austerity and fight this whole agenda, would also like to do. And wouldn't it be amazing and powerful if we could start imagining that workers identified the resistance of indigenous people as fighting against the same adversary and being part of the same movement? So I see in Defenders of the Land and more recently in March, this agreement between Defenders of the Land and I Will No More. I mean, I don't know if you could say a bit about this, Ben, coming together and announcing this sort of plan for actions that you talked about coming up this summer and so forth. As an indigenous movement, First Nations movement, but one that has an orientation to developing and cultivating alliances and mutual support, and like how you imagine that happening, what that looks like, because I would love to be part of building on that example.
Okay. Yeah, so to give maybe a little bit more background of Defenders of Land as a network, basically we started in 2008 as a network between primarily First Nations communities that were engaged in direct land defense struggles, and so bringing together a lot of those communities that I actually mentioned, from KI to Sharrae Lake, all the way out to communities in BC fighting Enbridge, communities in Alberta, to the East Coast, communities dealing with fisheries, to try and bring those communities together in a way that hadn't really been, I think, tried and approached since maybe the 70s and 80s, when there was a really big surge of indigenous activism across the country, to really try and coordinate experiences and even movements, even actions together. And from the outset as well, the network also tried to bring together a number of allied groups and movements. And so there has been some participation, some support from the labor movement, from groups like the Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Movement here in Ottawa, and similar groups that exist in a number of urban locations or universities across the country, to a few other groups that share similar goals and intentions. It's been a difficult sort of network and alliance to build off the ground, particularly because of geographical and economic issues, to try and actually bring people together from sometimes very remote communities has been a challenge, and to keep everybody sort of informed and connected. But we've been really happy in the past number of months. We've been talking sort of behind the scenes and working behind the scenes with I Don't Know More, and some of the founders, some of the sort of coordinators in different locations, to basically talk about how we can deepen and expand and grow this movement in a way that gives us a much sort of better basis for achieving what we're all after. Because from our perspective, I Don't Know More was great in that it had an incredible attraction, incredible visibility, but it wasn't so much grounded in a lot of the actual communities. And so we had the communities on our side, but we didn't have the widespread visibility, attraction, and people power. And so we've been trying to sort of figure out how we can sort of best find some sort of work and walk forward in that mode. And thinking about that, our plans, for the next immediate while have actually focused on, for the summer, doing a lot of work around education, skills building. And so we've got plans potentially to do workshops, trainings, starting in the prairies and then possibly working all the way east, possibly doing some stuff up north and in British Columbia as well. Primarily aimed at First Nations young people, but also trying to reach urban centers as well, and get people more informed, more involved, and then coordinating around a number of potential days of action. So as I mentioned, the first one would probably be sometime in either late June or early July, focused around solidarity with the Alberta Tar Sands Healing Walk, and then also gearing up for maybe another coordinated action sometime in the fall. To try and bring a lot of different communities together, but I think the real important part is going to be a lot of the education, a lot of visiting the communities, a lot of getting people in touch with each other, because what the movement has done up to now has been incredible, and I think there's so much more potential there if only we can get people really informed, really educated, really excited to commit and to participate in the future.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. Anyone have a short comment or question?
I do.
I don't think you're allowed.
No, I was sort of thinking about Kevin's question and how the challenge of responding to it. Right? I mean, if you take the issue of accountability, I mean, in fact, the attack on Spence is about number 3 down the list in terms of historical order, right? First of all, it was the Sunshine List publishing the salaries of everybody working in the public sector that earn more than $100,000, right? Then there's all the legislation forcing unions to make...
377.
Sorry?
Bill 377.
Right.
C-377.
To make expenditures public. So I mean, what...
Which is exactly the same as what they're doing with the native groups.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly the same thing. I mean, I think part of the question, I think, is, I mean, how do we frame the issues in ways that we're able to get both struggles going on at the same time, right? That's sort of one, that's a question. I think the other part of this is that, I mean, at least those of us who've been around the labor movement have not been unmindful, to put this delicately, right, of the limits of internal democracy and accountability to members in some parts of the labor movement. And we've always struggled with the question of how do you defend principles at the same time as acknowledging some of the challenges that members face in terms of controlling those unions and the way in which their centralization and lack of accountability or responsiveness to members creates problems within them. So I mean, I guess the other question, I guess, is how do we deal with the shortcomings within our own movements as we try to build forward?
Thanks, Donald. So we will be having about, I would say, maybe a 10 to 15-minute coffee break. I'm hoping the panelists will be here to answer questions or speak with you if you'd like. And then we'll be breaking up into groups and working on the second part of today's agenda. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Jarrar is going to be starting us off, and she is a Palestinian solidarity activist who is Palestinian, and she moved to Canada in 2003, and Yafa now works as the outreach volunteer and program coordinator at Oprah Carleton.
Hey, Oprah.
Hey. Thank you. Yeah, it's exciting. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I will be speaking, well, this session is kind of more of how we're fighting back, or how can we fight back. And Geoff and I had a little conversation yesterday, and we were talking about, it's not that different communities and different people haven't been fighting back. A lot of people have been fighting back and have been resisting. But there's definitely a certain gap that we're experiencing within resisting different aspects of austerity. As we have heard from the panelists before, austerity doesn't just take one shape or one kind of definition, but it does overlap with so many different issues depending on our socio-political, economic status. It affects us differently and in so many different ways. So maybe the aim of this discussion, and hopefully it will turn into a discussion afterwards as opposed to like just a lecture, is to see how we can put together these different forces that are working and are trying to resist these destructive aspects of austerity. And I will be speaking from my own experience, so I do speak only on behalf of my experience as a Palestine solidarity activist in Canada, and also being involved in different aspects of international solidarity movement back home in Palestine before I came here. I also grew up in a family that's political and activist parents, and both ex-political prisoners, etc. So this is where I will be coming from. And I did learn a lot, actually, from my work here as a Palestine solidarity activist than from my work as an activist back home. Because here I realized that I am part of the international solidarity movement. I'm not part of the resistance movement from inside Palestine. I'm kind of more part of the international solidarity movement outside, but also I'm part of, by doing so, I became part of different movements as well, because I realized that I learned a lot throughout the way that I can't just be a Palestine solidarity activist in a vacuum from everything else that's around me. So that meant me realizing and learning and continue to learn that I also, I'm an activist against Israeli apartheid, calling for equality, human rights, justice, ending of occupation, ending of apartheid. I'm speaking about these issues, recognizing that I'm also on colonized land of indigenous peoples here. So it kind of was a shift for me and really a turning point, not knowing many of these issues and realizing that it would be very hypocritical of us in the Palestine International Solidarity Movement to be speaking about Israeli apartheid and the situation in Palestine without standing in serious solidarity with the indigenous people here and with other aspects of colonization and oppression of different groups in this colonized land. So what we have learned, so I will be speaking from that perspective, but also I guess as some of you may know, our recent mobilization and resistance against the conservative, because it was the conservatives who attempted to attack Carleton as part of a larger attack on PERGs around the country, but also on public interest mainly, has been quite an experience. It was very inspiring and I learned a lot. And I also will be speaking about those tactics and these strategies and what we have learned from it, because it was an amazing mobilizing opportunity on campuses. And in my opinion, because since I moved here, I kind of been within the academic arena or academic apparatus in different campuses in Canada and in the UK, that the student movement actually on campuses is just a micro setting for people who actually go and then become part of the larger society, who become politicians, who become workers, who become lawyers and bad people and good people, right? So it is really one of the places, not the only, of course, because it's in itself a privilege to be part of these academic institutions, especially universities, but they are a reflection of the larger society around. And I was also involved in the student movement back home. And the different things that I have learned between the student movement here, and it's not just one movement, but I'm speaking generally, and for example, the student movement in Palestine, is that the student movement in Palestine was able to actually shape and reshape the political status and the political momentum at large. So the university unions elections, for example, that take place for student unions are a reflection of who's going to win the elections generally in the country. So that's very powerful. Students hold a lot of power in shaping politics. And I don't think that's unique to Palestine. I think that's unique to many different places. And maybe in certain points, at certain historic points, maybe in Canada, but definitely not at the moment. So this has been kind of the things that I've been trying to learn. And some of the things that I'm still learning also from this experience is the tactics and strategies that we have been using. So within the Palestine Solidarity Movement, so I'm going to be going back and forth here. For example, while it's important that we have tried a wide range of different tactics in order to win popular opinion, including lobbying politicians, to demonstrations, to phone pressures on corporate executives, to civil disobedience, to direct action, different kinds of methods. we discovered that we actually needed to have a serious discussion within the Palestine Solidarity Movement about what has worked, and to ensure that we choose the most effective tactics among them. So there has been different kind of organizing conferences and meetings. One of the last ones that I've been to was in November in Brazil for the World Social Forum on Palestine. It was a really a great opportunity actually to meet the international solidarity movement of Palestine. A lot of it was composed of labor folks who are involved in the labor movement around the world. So that was very inspiring. But I think from my experience, one of the most effective tools and tactics in North America and the West for the Palestine Solidarity Movement has been the popular education approach. It has been a central success for us, really. From speaker events like this, discussions, to email lists and kind of how to navigate that, to films and music festivals and music events, to teachings, to public forums, to speak outs, street theater. More people started to understand the situation in Palestine through these kinds of methods, and also on campuses, than just the kind of older methods that have been used within the Palestine Solidarity Movement, such as, just issuing statements and working within our hubs only. And the other really important part and central to that, and I'll try to bring it all together for Palestine activists, has been the fact that we were able and are still able to ally ourselves with anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and like-minded groups around us, right? Who are also working to fight different forms of oppression. But how we can actually create this meaningful solidarity with each other. This became very powerful, especially amongst the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That is the most recent within the Palestine resistance movement. Of course, it's evolving. So BDS, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is one tool that's used internationally. But this has been really a clear example of how Palestine solidarity activists have been able to create real alliances with different anti-racist groups and groups who work within anti-oppressive frameworks. Using the language of rights, using the language of colonization and decolonization, that really standing in solidarity with different groups, such as groups who are fighting for sexual rights, or Tamils, or indigenous groups, wherever we are, that has been really successful. And we started seeing these successes through the different actual outcomes that have come from the movement. So we started seeing BDS resolutions passing in different aspects of society, from labor unions to student unions to churches to different aspects of civil society, without us being there. Kind of started happening within those groups without even us knowing about it until it already passed. So there's no need for me to go and lobby for these people to pass. But that has been one tactic that's very important. So the other thing is that we had to be proactive in order to make these things successful. So within BDS, for example, divestment, which is taking investments or withdrawing our investments from certain corporations, has been very successful in terms of appealing to labor unions and labor groups, connecting the global to the local, so kind of like thinking globally and acting locally. So when we talk about divestment in terms of Palestine, and I want to reach to a certain audience who work on local labor issues in their communities, we talk about companies like G4S, Veolia, BAA Systems, Northrop Grumman. These are companies that different aspects of the Canadian society, including universities, including branches of the government, are heavily invested in, right? So the investments in these companies and these corporations have, of course, serious effects internationally on international policy. We are putting our pension money and pension investments in companies that produce weapons to kill people elsewhere. But also, what are the effects of these investments on our local economic situation? So when people started to make these connections, it strengthened the solidarity movement, right? Because we are acting locally on certain issues, boycotting and pressuring these corporations, or pressuring our institutions to pull their investments from these corporations, while at the same time being committed to a global justice-oriented movement, right? We were able to also appeal to environmentalist groups when we talk about certain companies that do unethical investments and harm the environment everywhere in the world, including here in Canada. We were able to appeal to human rights groups, of course, even in certain circumstances, and we may disagree on strategies, especially when we talk about something like boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And in the earlier discussion here, something was brought up about the sweatshops around the world, and even the recent catastrophe that happened in Bangladesh with the workers who, work in very unsafe working conditions, not just unsafe, outrageous working conditions. So we can go to Loblaws and buy a t-shirt from there. And what we can do to do that? Well, the one easy answer for me is to boycott Loblaws first, right? And also start holding educationals in different aspects of society why we need to boycott Loblaws. So one way is to, yes, to have picket lines outside Loblaws and leaflet, but that's not the only way we can have an effective boycott of Loblaws. And the other thing that I feel these kinds of strategies are important, and again, I want to bring back how we appeal to different groups to make the movement stronger. We also, not only in Brazil, the South African contingent, for example, was one of the strongest and one of the largest for the World Social Forum on Palestine. And we learn a lot from them, and we continue to learn from them, because the South African experience fighting apartheid in South Africa is very resourceful, really, because they dealt with negotiating and renegotiating strategies, right, to fight apartheid from so many different areas. So one was armed resistance, which is very necessary in these situations, and the other was boycott, divestments, and sanctions, and they go hand in hand. It's not either this or that. BDS is usually labeled as the non-violent tool of resistance that will appeal to an audience, maybe in the West as well, more easily. And it is also, if we look at the nitty-gritty of the details, it's very liberal in terms of language. So it uses the human rights language, it uses the equality language, it uses all these things. So one of the things that we learned from the lessons that they learned from their experience is that, well, yes, divestments are very effective and they're very important, because the one main thing about divestment is the purpose, really, is to make corporations and companies so uncomfortable to the point where they feel that it's not worth it anymore, and they just pack up and leave, or they just dropped that investment. These pressures really work, and they have been working. I was also in a tour for Israeli Apartheid Week in March in the UK, where universities there have been so successful in pushing away corporations from their campuses. While I was there, Veolia lost its contract in Dundee, in Birmingham. It was about to lose it in Sussex, and they had the biggest, longest occupation in University of Sussex in Brighton. So there are really a lot of success stories that we can learn from. And we will be successful. We are, successful in certain aspects here, but we can be really strong and successful. Acts like this cannot really sustain. So when I speak from a Palestine solidarity movement perspective, we say that any system that's kind of based on the oppression of people, the continuous ethnic cleansing of a population, and sustained through these corporations cannot really last, right? But we have to do it right. And one of the things, and I'm going to wrap up really quickly here, one of the things that I learned from the OPIRG experience, which is again a small experience but could be applied within a larger, bigger scale, is our use of educational really on campus. We had a huge success in the last fight. And the last fight came deliberately from the conservatives, where they have been training young people to mobilize on campuses. So in the last few years we saw, before that, the conservative movement on campuses was very weak. They're very disorganized because they have really no goal or no aim except for to destroy things. And in the last Manning conference that happened in Ottawa, where they brought Ron Paul, who appeals to young people because of the liberty language, and people like Rick Santorum, I don't know how he appeals to young people, but he does, and Howard from Australia. And this year, and of course we send infiltrators to these conferences every year to report what happens, like they do in our conferences. But this year they witnessed the largest attendance of young people, right? Where they mobilized them, and then from that, immediately after, they launched the progressive conservative groups on campus, which is, the older party that Stephen Harper used to be a part of. And then from that came Team Clark, which are the teams that they work with. And their strategies their main two goals are to destroy things like PIRGs, the public interest, and the Canadian Federation of Students on campuses. So their two main goals are to destroy things, right? That they're not proactive because they are unable to be proactive in creating new campaigns, but to destroy things that have already been happening on campuses. Destroy anything that does any work regarding social justice, environmental justice, anything that could potentially be a form of dissent to governments and to administrations. They managed to not infiltrate, but stack student unions with people who have become agents of the administration. So these student unions and their representatives, their executives, have become, are doing the work that the administrations used to do, and the student as a student body used to fight. So now the administration is sitting down, and this is also part of a larger thing where the conservative government has been trying to water down, to neutralize, to hijack the discourse. We were able to hijack it back, right, in the OPIRG experience. One of the things that they attacked us for was how much we pay our staff. So this goes into attack on the labor movement, right? How dare you pay your staff a living wage? How dare you give your staff benefits? So what we did is that we went to the locals of our unions on campus and we said, we know what we're gonna do next year. We're gonna have teach-ins, we're gonna go to classrooms where there's lectures and give students workshops on workers' rights, right? When you wanna graduate, do you wanna work for a minimum wage or do you wanna work somewhere where you have benefits? Why is that outrageous? Why is that out of this world? But they managed to get students to say, oh no, I don't want my $6 to go to pay somebody healthcare. That idea in itself. Just 2 days ago, the president of the Undergraduate Student Association at Carleton voted in favor of increasing tuition fees. Something unprecedented, right? So there's two ways to go about this. Talk about it to students and talk about increasing of tuition fees and find ways to impeach a president like that. Why can't we do that, right? Impeach a president, close his office, have him go through a walk of shame. So this is all part of education. So I'm going to stop here. Sorry, I've been going over, and it's all over the place, but hopefully we'll have a good discussion. Thank you. Keep in mind, it's 3:15, and so we would like to, after, so it's going to be Geoff Bickerton, who is currently the research director of QPW. And so he's going to be talking, CUPW, and he's going to be talking to us about how, we can continue to fight austerity. But I just want to make a point that, we do want to make sure that everyone can engage and, as a conversation, that we can all talk about the ways that we can fight against austerity. So thank you, Geoff.
So how much time do I have?
Let's say, can you do it in like 6 minutes?
Yeah, that should cover it.
Yeah? Yeah.
So you do with what you have, okay?
I'm sorry.
So just imagine a 3-minute mic, and I have twice as much time.
I'm sorry I took all your time.
No, look, I actually think I should give 4 minutes of this time to Yafa, because I must say that as she was speaking, I think it helped transform me from a scenario which I've been feeling, which is a bit of gloom and doom about the upcoming struggles that the labor movement faces, to one of more of hope and of a sense of solidarity and potential. When you think of the labor movement, what we've been going through, if you want to put the age of austerity at 2008 or 2007 and a half or something, I mean, some of us would like say 1977 and others would say 19 whatever. So in some ways I really feel, I think that we can be very proud of how labor has behaved during this period of time. When you think that there's been some tremendous struggles around, just even take a look at the pension issue. We had year-long strikes in some places, and the key issues were not only the pensions of the existing members that then became the pensions of future workers. Mm-hmm. We've had strikes against two-tier wages and benefits. We've had strikes to preserve sick leave and other health benefits. We've seen at the same time labor unions, many of them continuing, like when Harper cut the women's groups, the labor movement stepped up and provided funding. In terms of the Occupy movement, in most cities, labor unions were very, very supportive of the Occupy movement and didn't sort of, try to impose agendas on it. I mean, I think there was a lot of places where things worked out well. With respect to the Palestinian struggle, during this period of time, you've had more unions and more local unions adopt resolutions of support. You've had unions like the PSAC continue their struggle for pay equity during this period of time. I mean, they're at one level, I think, that we can say for all of its faults, which I'll come to in a second, the labor movement has attempted anyway to come to grips with the new realities that came about after the bankers decided to destroy the economic system. What we now face, though, and I think what makes some of us apprehensive, to say the least, is that we face a right wing in this country led by a tremendous right-wing leader, Stephen Harper, that is ready to move this struggle to another place. It's ready to actually go after the institutions of resistance and against one of the major institutions being the labor movement. And I think that we can expect within the next year, probably within the next few months, some type of legislative initiative that will go after what we call the RAND formula, or go after a variant of that. Labor unions, as you know, in this country, have an automatic dues deduction from members. So not just from members, from everyone who's covered by a collective agreement. So you don't have to be a member. You may object to being a member of a union, but you still have to pay union dues, and you have all the benefits of that union members do. And what we will likely see is an attempt to change that, either to eliminate compulsory dues collection or eliminate part of the dues collection, so identifying the dues that goes to collective bargaining and say everyone has to pay that, but the rest will be voluntary, or some variation of this. And this will change the complexion of our discussion within the labor movement anyway for quite a while. Because it will be a clarion call for the right wing within the labor movement to organize. It's a call for all those stay-at-home members who sort of grumble, but like the fact that their collective agreements have provided them with a fair bit of benefits, for them to organize so that they will not have to financially support an agenda that they don't agree with. And we all know that the labor movement and the composition of the movement is roughly that of the Canadian population. So we've got lots of Tories, we've got lots of Liberals, we've got New Democrats, we've got Communists, we've got Anarchists, maybe not enough, but we've got right-wingers. And this is what this is about. It's to stimulate a demand inside the union movement around its funding. And the right will frame that in terms of individual liberty. The right for you not to have to support or belong to organizations that you don't want to, or support some aspect of that organization's work. And of course, we will frame the issue very differently. And we'll talk about the importance of unions. We'll talk about the democratic character of unions. We'll talk about the fact that people can participate and change the directions of the unions, and it's a good chance that the right will in fact take us up on that offer, and they will. And here's when the rubber hits the road, as they say, the chickens come home to roost. And this is where we're going to face a tremendous challenge in our movement, because we have far too much complacency. I imagine there's many union members here. What percentage of union members attend meetings? Very little, very small. What percentage are active in their unions? Very small. So what I'm suggesting is that we will be undertaking a huge struggle inside our unions. And it will be one that also is played out outside of the unions, because it will be within the context of legislative changes. And we will be up against a lot. In Australia, the government outspent the unions by 10 times in terms of, information campaigns, and that's not including what the private sector did. Here we already have the, Merit Canada, a group that deals with trying to keep the construction industry non-union, attacking the PSAC for supporting students in Quebec. Whoa, this is going to be like a knife fight in a phone booth. It's going to go places that we don't expect, and it's not going to be pleasant for us. And we are going to have to reach down deep and communicate with our members and with our allies in ways that we have never done. And I think there's no estimate. That's not just a dramatic flourish here. Because we do communicate with them when we need them to come out and vote for strike votes. We do communicate with them when we have ratification votes. But now we're going to have to communicate with them around policy issues. And in many cases, they will be on issues where they oppose what we've been doing. And we will have to do that. And we will have to have this discussion, and at the very least, convince them that it's worth continuing to participate in the organization, and that may ensure that they have the avenues that they can in fact change our unions if they're successful. And that's the other thing that I think in terms of a challenge for us, and especially a challenge on the left, is making our unions more democratic. Also invites people that have a more right-wing perspective to, in fact, take leadership positions. And I say that, and I'll just close on this, I say this from a personal experience, and I think there are some people from the postal workers here, that after we had a merger of the letter carriers and the inside postal workers, forced merger in 1989, what we saw was we have a very democratic union. People can come to meetings, they can pass resolutions, and they can elect leaders. And we saw that a group of new members that felt that they were not represented could, by simply coming out to a few meetings, end up completely take over the executives and transform the nature of our local unions. So, to the extent that we're democratic, we're into a discussion around our unions, what the purpose of these unions is, and our activities that we have, including our political activities, as well as our activities at the workplace. So, and I think what I hope that we can talk about this afternoon, and would be, as union members, what is our strategy in terms of how we be approaching our members, and as allies, how can we support the labor movement? Because it will need every single bit of support it can get, because there's a lot of powerful forces that hate the fact that the labor movement stands up for human rights, stands up for Palestine, stands up against people who would cut back pensions, cut back welfare benefits, cut back public housing, and we stand in favor of those that stand up for the environment.
The building will fall.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.